sparkling. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for this webinar on designating radionuclides as a chemical of mutual concern in the Great Lakes Basin. And I'm turning it over to our presenter, John Jackson. John?
Okay, thank you, Brene, and thank you for organizing this, and thank you to all of you on the phone. I think most of you have already signed on to our letter requesting the designation. So we wanted to use this time to, first of all, just go through it fairly quickly, certainly less than half an hour, to actually go through sort of why we've done this, the reasoning, and what the process is in terms of designation. And then to spend the last half hour, actually we've lost about 7 minutes already, but the last period of time for not just questions, but also for strategy in terms of how we can work further to try to achieve the designation. First of all, I think all of you have seen this map, actually, that Anna Tillman and I put together in 2013. Actually, we updated this map from one that Irene Koch had already started. And what's interesting is that since this map came out, at the first meeting of the Great Lakes Executive Committee, which is the EPA and U.S. Federal and Environment Canada people who have prime responsibility for implementing the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, we took this map to them to show the extreme extent of facilities associated with radioactive issues around the basin. And repeatedly since then, it has become an item that comes up at Great Lakes Executive Committee meetings, radionuclides. It had not before. And to give you an indication of the little scare factor there, suddenly a member from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission joined the Great Lakes Executive Committee and comes to every meeting since. So they certainly will have their eyes out for this designation request. In the past, many of you have tried to use the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement as a mechanism to get at radionuclides and to get more of a focus on it. The IJC has come through with some good recommendations for us in the past around radionuclides. One was that the government should recognize that these are persistent toxic substances. And in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, the goals in terms of persistent toxic substances are zero discharge and virtual elimination from the environment. And they made a recommendation quite some time ago to the governments to therefore treat them in the same way as they do other persistent toxic substances like organochlorines, for example. And the government response has been, we're taking care of it, no need for us to do anything else on it, and basically rejected the proposal. Also, the IJC at one point put together a report where the head scientists, and included in that was one of our favorites, Rosalie Bertel, who looked at the monitoring, the data that's present around the Great Lakes and showed the huge inadequacies for us to be able to understand the impact of radionuclides around the Great Lakes Basin. And again, the governments did nothing in response to that report. So this is, and in addition, many of you on the call have been taking things like the DGR proposals to the IJC and saying, hey, why don't you do something like this? The proposal, when there's the transportation proposal around for taking out the steam generators, again, many of you went to the IJC, and basically they said, well, we don't really have jurisdiction on this, and sort of pushed it aside. So the new Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement has given us another way to try to move this issue forward. And in the new agreement, Annex 3 is the one that deals with toxic chemicals. And in it, they didn't actually designate any chemicals as being their concerned chemicals. Instead, what they did is they set up a process for designating chemicals of mutual concern. And basically the word mutual here means of concern throughout the entire basin, of concern on both the U.S. and Canadian sides, mutual. And so what they are then doing is going through a process of trying to designate chemicals of mutual concern. If a chemical is designated as a mutual concern, then two things happen. One is that they have to make a commitment to gather more information so we can fully understand what's happening in the Great Lakes with them, the threat to the Great Lakes, but also to develop an action strategy in terms of what they can do to try to reduce the impact, or in terms of the goals of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, to get that down to zero. The heads of environment representative from each of them decide which substance to put on a list for consideration as chemicals of mutual concern. That's the first step, that they will consider it as a chemical of mutual concern. Once they've agreed to consider it, then they set up a scientific task force, but a task force that's made up of people from a range of sectors: government, industry, environmental groups, academics, to make a recommendation in terms of whether it actually should become a chemical of mutual concern. Then that recommendation, and they put that out for consultation, goes to the heads of the Annex 3 subcommittee. So that's the same two people up in step one that I described. And the heads, of course, are not bound by the recommendations that the task force makes, but what they do is they make their own recommendation to the heads of the Great Lakes Executive Committee, which is Environment Canada, EPA, the heads of the Great Lakes programs, to make an actual decision. Thus far, we've gone through this process for some chemicals, and the heads of Annex 3 co-leads recommended the ones that are on this sheet. I'm not going to go through them. You can read them there, and you know them better than many of you. So it went through the process. They made some changes from the recommendations that the task force had made. In one case, added one the task force had not considered ready yet because of industry concern, added HBCD to ones that had not been agreed to by all members of the task force. And what has happened then is that those recommendations were made to the Great Lakes Executive Committee back in June 2015. They still have not been designated as chemicals of mutual concern. And I don't think it's because there's actually any conflict or any hesitation in doing it, but on the Canadian side, we got delayed by the federal election, and they can't do stuff like this during the federal election. Anything that hints at controversy cannot be done during the federal election. And then after the election happened, they have to then rebrief because they have a new minister and so on. And the priority for the minister was clearly, and for the government, was greenhouse gases because of the Paris meetings, etc. So those still have not been designated. I think they were very close to doing it. Now, of course, there will probably be another delay because of Susan Hedman, who is the EPA head of the Great Lakes program, who has now resigned. And I suspect that will create another delay. But I expect that at some point those ones will be designated, timing unknown. But what they have also done is they've added a process for the public to recommend that a substance be considered for designation. So far, I don't think anyone has used that process, but we are certainly intending to use that process for radionuclides. Whoops, went too far. Okay. So I'll just quickly hit on the bases for our recommendations, and I don't need to say anything about the first two, the people on this call. You know the concerns about radionuclides, the health effects. I won't discuss that. You all are part of and agree with the thing that we even have to consider low levels of exposure can be very significant. And the third point there in terms of yes, we do come in contact with them naturally from the earth, but that makes that the results in terms of the human activities in terms of stirring up radionuclides and exposing us to radionuclides become even more critical, because those are ones we can have some sort of control over. So I won't go through those in more detail. The other, of course, is in our argument for having the designated as chemicals of mutual concern, always remember both sides being affected, is that we have this huge number of facilities around the Great Lakes, around all of the lakes on both sides of the border except Lake Superior. And therefore, that this is clearly a Great Lakes-wide issue. It's clearly a U.S.-Canada issue, and therefore they really need to be paying attention to that. And of course, in addition to the large numbers of facilities that you see on this map, there are proposals that many of you are, I think probably all of you, are working and fighting at the moment. The DGR1 proposal, which already has gotten, it's in the approval stage. DGR2, which is for long-term nuclear fuel bundles. 8 of the 9 sites still on the list for that site are in the Great Lakes Basin. Some around Lake Huron, some on the east shore, some up on the north shore, and some along Lake Superior. So this is clearly an ongoing issue. The other thing, of course, is that the huge number of facilities. For example, we have about 38 operating reactors, nuclear power reactors around the Great Lakes Basin, and about 12 closed reactors around the basin, and they also create a threat. And of course, with all those facilities are waste facilities associated with them, or at least waste that are sitting there. And of course, the other big concern we have is transportation of waste along the water or across rivers that flow into the Great Lakes, and how that could spread very rapidly throughout the Great Lakes. So again, that's a major part. So the first 2 points there on this slide I've already covered because they're on the map. The next issue in terms of our argument is that these are persistent toxic substances, and as the IJC has said, and therefore they are most persistent of substances that we have out there, at least some of them. This means that we have to take strong protective measures to protect the Great Lakes. The thing also is that the Great Lakes have unique characteristics that make them particularly susceptible to the persistent toxic substances. And in addition that we don't have enough scientific information to really understand what's going on. We know they're a threat. We know there's a major number out there, and we need to then get the information and make a plan. So what are the next steps in terms of getting on with this? And I'll turn it over to Faye at this moment to go through this. But I just want to stress before turning it over to Faye that the real thing that's going on here is that we need to be making the argument to the governments of chemicals of mutual concern, and the step that we go through when we make the formal application, which is the stage that we're at now, and we're thinking of doing that sometime in February, is to then after that the governments decide whether they accept them becoming a candidate. And it's basically the two heads that I talked about before of that are heads of the subcommittee will make the recommendation about whether to consider them as candidate. In the process that's been set up, it's been made very clear that one government on its own can decide that they recommend that it go ahead as for consideration as a substance of concern and could go ahead to a task force even if both governments did not agree. I'd be surprised if it happened that way, but it can, and therefore we need to keep that open as we're thinking about our strategy. And obviously, we also need to do ongoing campaign to, first of all, get it designated or get it recommended for consideration, and an ongoing campaign, if we succeed in that, to make sure that we get the actual designation, and then what the strategy needs to be in terms of getting rid of the radionuclides or taking care of the problems. So I'll turn it over to Faye now to take us through the next steps.
Thank you, John, and thank you to everyone who's on the call. Considering I'm looking at the names of the list of participants, and I'm happy to say that many of you have signed on to the NGO letter that we sent around a week and a half ago, and we're still getting good response from that. That said, I would like to just outline the next steps. We are sending out the letter again. Sorry about that. Sending out the letter again for sign-on until February 1st, with hope that you could share that. Share that letter off with other folks that are going to that may add their name of support to the letter, and we'll keep that open until February 1st. We'll send that around again to various folks, which may include also the link to this presentation to help give some grounding to that. As John had said, we will submit the letter along with the CELA report that gives a little bit more detail to substantiate the nomination to both the head of the Great Lakes Executive Committee. Currently at Environment Canada, it's Mike Goffin, and Susan Hedman, as you know, as everybody probably has realized by this point, has just resigned from EPA, so we'll have to deal with identifying who that person would be on EPA side. We're going to be working with a media person just to figure out when the letter, what timing we'll use to release the letter and the report. So the third bullet point is just identifying what that media strategy is, and we'll keep everybody informed on what's going on that end. And as John had mentioned, I think it is important to try to figure out ways to get support from other organizations, certainly outside the NGO sector, to support this type of nomination. So I think a lot of effort's going to go on to try to get groups like the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiatives to consider supporting this type of nomination, working with our First Nations and tribes contact to do the same. So from the perspective of steps, I think the letter, the NGO letter, and the CELA report will formulate the first steps to supporting the designation of radionuclides in the Great Lakes as a chemical of mutual concern. So I guess I'll hand it back to you, John, to conclude.
Well, actually, we'll turn on to Brene now to facilitate our discussion. Brene, are you on mute?
Thank you, Faye and John. That was very helpful. We've got a couple of questions. So now we're going to go. I am going to go, and I'm going to move us into question
All
and
attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
You're now able to unmute or mute your own line. We've got a couple of questions we'll start with that have come in through the chat, through the text box. So first question is from Brian. Will the slideshow be available for use by signatories in public education? And I'll start by saying, Brian, that this recording is going to be available through any meeting, and Faye will send around the link following. But John or Faye, are we going to be able to share the slides?
Of course, Faye, can you put them up on the CELA site?
Absolutely, we'll do that. And we'll also include the link to the recording as well.
Great, thank you, Faye. A question from Kevin. Will Susan Hedman's resignation over the Flint, Michigan drinking water catastrophe as the EPA Region 5 administrator, how will that impact this effort, or will it impact this effort? And you touched on this briefly, John, but could you elaborate?
Yeah, no, I'll come back in terms of the next steps. Is that today I'm going to actually make a couple of calls to the GLEC Secretariat and see if I can get any sense of things. But so it may affect the timing of it going in, but I think we still need to proceed on the basis of the sort of time frame we were talking of. We may not actually make the formal submission as quickly as we'd expected on the basis of that. It's going to take some exploration. I'm suspecting that they will appoint an interim person to fill that position, which is often the senior civil servant, the senior non-presidential appointment. I know in the past, for example, that Dave Ulrich, who's now the head of the Great Lakes Cities Initiative, he often became the fill-in person. We always started kidding. He was the acting director. He kept filling in that position. I suspect something similar will happen here, but we don't know at this point. So we have to have some flexibility.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, John. We've got a question from Linda. What are the implications of this action for researchers in hospitals, universities, and other research institutes using radioactive substances? John?
Well, certainly in terms of doing people, we're getting echo. Okay. Well, certainly, I'll just give some of my perspective on it. Certainly, in terms of researchers who are wanting to do research on radionuclides, impact in the Great Lakes, et cetera, that it will, if we got the designation, a major part of the work would be to get the scientists and to be funding the scientists to do more of the research that's needed. In terms of, if we were talking of it being the hazards within the labs, I don't know. It may be looked at as one of the sources to the Great Lakes. I'm certainly open to comments anyone else might have in terms of that aspect of it.
Right. Thanks, John. We have another question from Gail that I'll read out, but I'll just let people know that I did have to go in and mute from my end a couple of the mics because we were getting background noise. So if you're one of those people who I muted and you want to ask a question, just go to the Interact and click on the hands up, and I'll see that you want to ask a question, and I'll unmute your mic if I happen to mute your mic from this end. Question from Gail Snyder from Illinois. Other than the nuclear industry or governmental entities looking to have flexibility in dealing with nuclear materials, are there any other groups you would expect to oppose adding radionuclides to the list of chemicals of mutual concern? Thank you, Gail. John?
Well, I actually would like to turn this. I mean, this is a knowledgeable group on the phone. I'd like to hear from others because that will help us figure out the campaign.
Any other comments or thoughts on that? From where might we expect to find some resistance to this initiative? Any ideas?
Hi. It's Brian.
Brian, go ahead.
It would occur to me that the Ontario Power Generation might not be on side with this. And in the same way, the Bruce plant, which is owned and packed by private enterprise outside of the country, but which deals with Ontario Power Generation, would not be on side with this.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, this is Faye De Leon from CELA. I sit on the Stakeholder Advisory, the extended committee that was established under the Annex 3 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And certainly one of the challenges that we're going to have to deal with if we're at the point of having the government accept this as possible designation would be to try to identify our allies to nominate to support that kind of listing. So it has to, as John has said, this work will have to go through a review by a scientific committee. So anywhere where we need to identify the appropriate people to sit in and support that designation will be critically important to the process. Having said that, when a nomination does come through and the government receives them, the executive committee receives them, they have up to a year to respond to that nomination and figure out whether they're going to accept that. So there'll be several points of entry where one, we could face some sort of opposition, or enhance our support for that nomination.
Great, thank you, Faye. We've got a comment from Sarah that it would be helpful to add examples to reinforce that there are best practices underway. For example, in Durham region, GTA area, OPG is distributing rad block pills, KI pills. We also have a comment from Kevin following up on Hedman and her resignation, that given the international media attention on Flint, the timing is good. There's a lot of attention, a lot of tension, focus on that. So there's a lot of concern nationwide about public health. So strategically, our timing is good for the push on this. And Kevin's got a little more detail if you want to check the chat box and read that. Other comments or questions?
Bernine, can I just ask one technical thing? The comments that are written there, which are extremely valuable, are those also saved after this? After we end the webinar, they don't just disappear?
That's right. We'll get a report with them.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Hi, Bernine, can you hear me? It's Anna.
Yeah, go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, I put something in the chat, but I didn't see it coming up. A couple points. One of the things to stress too is that radionuclides, the emissions, they're cumulative. They will continue to go on for a very long time. So I noticed the persistence is stressed, it's also cumulative. Second thing is, John and I sit on the NPRI, National Pollutant Release Inventory Work Group, and we have been advancing listing radionuclides on the inventory. I think that's another thing that we will be further advancing this, and it looks like there may be a subcommittee on it. I think that would be a helpful adjunct to this endeavor. So just to let you know, and we probably would be asking support for people on this in a similar way. One I did try to ask was the timelines. Even though something may be nominated of chemicals of mutual concern, it may take quite a while before any action would proceed. So I think that is something of concern to me, having been on one of those subcommittees, how long it takes before anything would even begin. So just, I think getting them on in a timely fashion is also important. That's all.
Can I go back? Can I go back to Anna's first point about getting on the National Pollutant Release Inventory? We also should start pushing to get it put on the Toxics Release Inventory in the U.S. because what we're going to need is equivalent data all around the Great Lakes Basin. So we need it there as well.
Great, thank you, John. Other comments, questions? Don't see any. I don't see any hands up or comments in the text box. Kevin asking, are groups outside the basin welcome to sign on? John or Faye?
Yes, this is Faye, and we have been adding people who are outside the Great Lakes Basin. I think all of you have done a wonderful job in sharing the letter. So we have been getting support even from outside the country. So to the extent that our focus is around the Great Lakes Basin, I have not refused anyone at this point to add them onto the list. So, keep them coming.
I think we have about 60 signatories right now, something like that, Faye, is that right?
Correct.
Great, thanks. And Sarah adds a question. One benefit would be improved surveillance.
Definitely.
So I'm not seeing more questions or comments in the text box or hands out. John or Faye, do you want to add any?
Yeah, if I can just say one thing, it's really in follow-up to what Faye talked about, or not Faye, Sarah had just talked about, and it's in the cover letter that you people have been signing on to, But we have a suspicion that industry and governments and so on will say, well, there isn't enough information yet there to be ready to go on to action. And the real concern here and the real catch here is that the IJC already put out a report a couple of decades ago saying there isn't enough information there, but we need the information, and the governments have not improved the getting of information. So Annex 3, under the Chemicals of Mutual Concern, really emphasizes the requirement for industry, once they've designated a chemical of mutual concern, to get the data, to get the information, to improve that research, etc. So that is one big reason for getting them designated. And certainly the number of sources around the Great Lakes Basin indicate the need, and that is both sides of the basin is very clear, and the nature of the threat is very clear. So we should not let them away with using that as an excuse to try to put this off, because the agreement is very clear that science is part of the work you have to do once you have designated.
Oh, sorry. You just reminded me. It's Anna here. Can I ask one little question? It really relates to the First Nations support for this, and rather than just a sign-on, I would gather that there would be interest in getting First Nation support for this.
If you look at, I've just flipped the slides back to the previous one, and what we were saying is once we set in and made the formal application for a designation, that then we need to go to get the campaign to get others to support our request for designation. And we gave, for example, here the Cities Initiative. We also said there First Nations and tribes. I'm sure there are others, and I think it would be useful if people have ideas now on the call or later in terms of other organizations, other groups that we could go to support our request for the designation. We did not include these groups in the sign-on to this letter because for some of these, it's awkward to do that. First Nations and tribes, for example, it's awkward to do that in terms of they're just another stakeholder, whatever they clearly are not. But in addition, that we think it'll really add strength to our designation if Environment Canada and EPA start getting letters over the next couple of months that are coming in and saying, hey, we support the application for designation.
Yeah, well, on that, I do have a suggestion to community health centers in the Great Lakes Basin. If they specifically addressed a letter, we can get of them. And so again, that's another way of getting the health involved in this. But it's in particular community health centers in the Great Lakes Basin.
Does anybody have other suggestions of, not for the sign-on for now, the quick thing, but to have them at some point send letters of support for the designation? Other suggestions?
I think, Kevin, do you want to go ahead? I think you've been waiting for a chance.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up on the whole the Flint crisis. And another thought that came to my mind was that the EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy, I think it was last Friday, put out a directive to her nationwide staff at EPA that if there is a, impending public health emergency, that staff members need to speak up. And Governor Snyder of Michigan, who may be forced to resign, let's hope, over what's happened during his State of the State, pretty much said the same thing. And so I guess that's another opportunity for us, is that the agencies and the government institutions that are supposed to protect public health and the Great Lakes have now been directed by their bosses to actually do their job. So one example for me, a recent revelation that radioactive steam generators were shipped by boat down Lake Michigan, through Chicago, down the Mississippi to Texas for burial secretively from Point Beach Nuclear Power Plant in Wisconsin in the summer of 2014. It sure would have been nice if somebody would have let the public know about that. And it's just a repeat of what happened in November 2001 from Kewaunee, Wisconsin, 2 radioactive steam generators were secretly shipped. So the most recent shipment was 4. So, so many of us were involved in stopping Bruce Nuclear's attempt to ship a total of 64 radioactive steam generators, and we succeeded. But it was, thanks to Kay Cumbo and others getting the word out that it was even heading our way. So I hope that we can look to EPA, Environment Canada, perhaps, state of Michigan agencies to let us know what risks are coming our way.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. We have a comment or a question from Gail from Illinois. Is there any effort to organize people who get their water from Great Lakes? For example, I live in the area 35 miles from Lake Michigan. About 18,000 of people in our community get water from Lake Michigan, but they're not part of an organized or organized as a group, other than that they are all concerned about the costs of water. So I think this relates to John's question or request to call participants for their thoughts and ideas on how to extend or expand outreach to others to either sign on to the letter in the immediate term or send letters of support in the medium term. So John, are there others want to comment on that? I hear typing. Something's coming.
Oh, no, that was just me. Sorry. I'll stop typing.
Maybe, Anna, if you could mute when you're not speaking, that would be helpful. Sarah asks, risks from natural events, earthquakes, etc. should be cited. And Meg is asking, what is the scale of releases for medical imaging in the grander scheme? I don't know if anyone knows that directly or if we'll have to get back on that question. So if anyone can add in now on the research question, what is the scale of releases for medical imaging relative to other releases? Sarah reports that she is reporting to the steering committee tomorrow at the Toronto Cancer Prevention Clinic. And Meg's telling me the comment wasn't working. Her comments are going to only presenters. Meg, you might be able to select across from, there's a bar at the bottom with an invert. You might be on a private to presenters instead of to everyone. But I will share as the comments come in. But if others are having a problem.
Yeah, Meg's comment came through to everyone now.
Meg's came to everyone? Great.
But Diane is also asking how to unmute.
Okay, well, I'm not that far down. So I'll keep asking, is anyone providing networking functions that will compile a list of potential supporting organizations, contact them, track responses, provide follow-up. Relative to this initiative, Faye, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, we are certainly going to keep people up to speed on any responses we get from the final submission of our letter. And because CELA particularly, is sitting on the extended committee established under Annex 3, we will try to keep people up to speed on where it is in the process. So I anticipate that this is, again, the beginning of a longer dialogue with our colleagues who have supported the letter so far. And this is the initial stages of trying to figure out who else should we engage in this discussion.
Thanks.
Is there any chance for me to get in?
Pardon me?
I want to get on a queue to ask a question.
Yes, go ahead. You can do that now.
Oh, I'm having a lot of trouble figuring out how to use this, but here's my question. We got a telephone call from Gilman. We were talking to her, and she said that when you present in court, you have to say only stuff about financial results of these nuclear power plants. But if you mention radiation, it becomes a federal issue, and you can't do anything about it in local or state courts. and I wanted to know if these substances are called substances of concern, if we can be released from the necessity not to mention radiation when we discuss these things in local and state courts.
Teresa, I don't know, it's U.S. law, but have you any comment on that, Teresa?
I'm not sure I quite understand the context for the question. There's some, you're asking about strategy to not discuss radiation, or you're asking about risk from discussing radiation? I didn't quite catch the concern.
You say the law.
It was in California. Carol Gilman, who's concerned with San Onofre and Diablo Canyon, and she said when you go to court, you have to say that you have to restrict yourself to certain things. If you start to bring up the dangers of the radiation of the NPPs and their waste products and the transportation and all the other issues around human health and radiation, that the courts will not respect this, and that you have to bring these things only to national attention because it's a matter for the national laws and not the state and local laws.
Alfred, are you able to speak to this?
So in Canada, nuclear power has been designated federal under our Constitution, but the provincial governments here have responsibility to decide on energy supply, and in particular, particular projects may be provincially promoted, like the DGR, for example, or the Darlington rebuild. We have a similar switch, but about courts. There's no rule like. It just depends. What the courts.
Alfred, maybe if you could speak to this from the U.S. side.
Can you unmute, Alfred?
He's not muted from my end.
But he may be muted by himself. Himself.
Alfred, are you able to speak to this? Well, maybe.
This is Kevin. I could say a few words.
Sure, go ahead, Kevin. Thank you.
I've seen, just like Teresa just said about Canada, and I've seen some notes like from Diane Dorigo on the text. So the state of Vermont battle against Entergy Nuclear really is a recent update on this. The courts in the U.S. have consistently ruled, and there is Supreme Court precedent, that the federal government, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has sole jurisdiction on radiological safety matters, and the states can't touch that. And of course, it's very unfortunate because the NRC is derelict in its duty. But it's also clearly established by Supreme Court rulings that states retain jurisdiction over certain matters. And this was again affirmed at Vermont. Surface water discharges of thermal water, other things like energy policy, impacts on the economy, such as tourism and recreation. There's quite a list, and we're seeing that like at Indian Point, New York, where the governor of New York is requiring, as are the state agencies, that Indian Point install cooling towers and no longer dump, unimaginable amounts of thermal heat waste into the Hudson River, which may be the death blow to the license extension there. And the same is kind of happening at Diablo Canyon. So, there is room for states to maneuver, and some states are stepping up and doing so.
Thank you, Kevin.
So if I push to unmute here, does this unmute me?
Is that Dan?
Yeah, I think I have to hold this button down the whole time.
Yeah.
Oh,
You're
okay.
not muted now.
Okay.
Did you have a question? Or comment?
Well, it was a while back. I'm not quite sure where the flow was, but I wanted to point out, maybe it was on getting other people to support and write letters in. I wanted to just let people know that the Seneca Nation of Indians is now setting up a whole West Valley task force because there was a flyover done in late 2015.
Okay, Dee, we've lost you.
Okay, okay, I have to hold this down while I talk. There was a flyover with a gamma spec by the NNSA from West Valley along the, I guess I don't know how to, okay, all the way to the Great Lakes, and it showed some hot spots on the Seneca Nation. So the Seneca Nation is now alerted and concerned like about radioactivity like never before. So I will forward the letter to them and see if they'll do their own letter or sign on.
Great. Thanks, Dee. Kay,
And then
do you have a comment? Could you please mute? Kay Cumbo, comment or mute, please.
Oh, let's see. All right.
So we've got a couple of other comments down in the chat box. From Ethel, here in Michigan, we have a number of groups involved in opposition to drilling going on proposed. They may be a good source for joining the outreach. Great, Ethel, thank you for that. Comment from Kevin on, in addition to small quantities, also short-lived hazards, and suggesting Gordon Edwards may have additional information. Dee, your name is on the screen. And Kevin, did you want to say something additional?
That last part about short-lived and small quantities was a response to the question about nuclear medicine. And I also pointed out that there certainly are exceptions. So like technetium-99 is very long-lasting hazard. So Gordon Edwards may have more information about that.
Great, thank you. And comment from Dee that in the U.S. NRC super laws. Now,
yeah, it was
someone open because we're getting. So any additional questions or comments? We're at 10:53, 30 on the line. You've been an excellent group. Maybe we'll pass to John, Teresa, or Faye for any last words, final encouragements.
Well, if I can just say that, the response thus far to signing on to the NGO letter has been excellent, and so let's keep that going during the week. But let's also recognize, as we've been discussing on the call, that this is the beginning of a campaign. And once we've put in this formal application to start the process, then we're also needing other organizations, and we've discussed some of them on the phone, to send in their own letters of support for that application. I think that will add a lot of power to have that coming in over the next while. And certainly we'll be making sure that we get information out to you on anything that we learn around timing that may affect how quickly you need to get those in and that sort of thing. Faye, Teresa, anything to add?
So it's Teresa. I was just going to echo that this is about the long game, because as Faye and John pointed out, even if our letter is accepted and there's eventually a recommendation in support, there are a number of steps that have to be taken under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and then furthermore, a large number of things that could happen with respect to a chemical of mutual concern. And so engagement and attention by the public is really important to make sure that useful things happen as a result of that. So I echo what John says about the beginning of a campaign, and of course highly related to work that we're all doing in other venues dealing with radionuclides in the Great Lakes, specific project approvals and so on. It's worth building those relationships and exchanging knowledge the way we've been doing today. Over to Faye.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think this has been a very useful session for me, who's been involved in toxics work, but not specifically on radionuclides. So I appreciate the insight and the expertise on this call. I do want to just stress one of the points that John made in his presentation, which is the opportunity under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement to nominate these chemicals. Once we submit this letter, it would represent the first time a nomination has come through from outside of the government under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and I'm glad to see it is the radionuclides one. So I'm looking forward to participating in this campaign and trying to connect with all of you on this call and certainly others that will identify down the road. So please share the letter around. We will send another copy of the letter. Maybe the next version will include the full list of groups that have signed on so far, just to allow all of you the opportunity to review the information we have for you and to share it with other folks if that helps to generate more support. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you all. And Faye will be sending around a follow-up email with an update, and also that will include a link to this recording. And we've had a couple of suggestions come up in the chat box for additional documents. So those will all come to you in an email from Faye within the next few days. So thank you all very much. Great discussion, great presentations. 30 online. Thank you very much for a really good start to this initiative. So thank you. We'll close the recording now and close the webinar. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everyone.